brought to you by Charity Mobile, the phone company that supports life and family. 5% of your monthly plan price goes to your favorite charity. Buy the way you believe at CharityMobile.com and use promo code TRADITION. We're all tired of hearing or talking about synodality. I know I am. While the political world outside is focused on political contests happening right now in the United States or coming soon in Canada, and while the United Kingdom is dealing with the rather hair-raising consequences of recent such contests, and with the Olympics continuing on, many eyes are turned elsewhere. And the last thing most of us want to hear about is the Synod of Synodality. But after the Synod reconvenes in October 2024 to have more meetings about the need to have meetings in the church and to be more inclusive with those meetings, in the spring of 2025, study groups will be meeting in the name of synodality in Rome, and the heretical theologians with far too much influence in the church will be participating. One German theologian has come forward to tell us what the synod will be meeting about, and it isn't good. You're going to hear talk here about, in flowery language, about the need to decentralize authority and put it into the hands of laity. We've talked about this here many times before, and there's some moral underpinnings on this, moral teachings of the church that are being rejected in the name of synodality. And we are told that the church has been wrong about this. And the theologian here never says that. Instead, they always frame it in the language of the context has changed. And when the context of the church has changed and the context of the world has changed, the church must rethink what it does. The reasoning for that is because if they say the church has always been wrong about that sin that Father James Martin has got a lot of unhealthy interest in for a priest, they admit that, they destroy magisterial authority, and they know that, so they're being careful. But this is the end goal, to change what the church teaches on that sin and on several other sins of the flesh. It's always sins of the flesh with the heretics. At the core of any heresy, you dig a little deeply and you're going to find sins of the flesh. Why do they always come up? Because it is the sins of the flesh that cause people to leave the faith. And instead of leaving the Catholic faith, these heretics want to change the Catholic faith to meet their demands. Bear that in mind. Headline from Katholisch.de, the official news arm of the German Bishops' Conference. Moral theologian, rethinking traditional considerations on the James Martin sin. The Italian moral theologian Maurizio Chiodi was recently appointed by Pope Francis as a member of the expert group on controversial issues. Some had previously criticized him for his stance on controversial topics such as that sin that James Martin has entirely too much interest in. Now he speaks about it in an interview with Katholisch.de. One thing the Synod of Synodality has been pushing very hard for is taking decision-making power about morality, doctrine, by logical extension, dogma, and putting that decision-making power into the hands of the laity, or at the very least having laity in the room when our shepherds are confronting doctrinal and moral issues in Rome, having their voices heard, and for whatever reason, having the voices of the worst catechized generation in history taken seriously on the reality of morality. This is a repudiation of the idea of magisterial authority, at the very least. This theologian is admitting fully that the plan is to toss out the church's teaching on that sin that Father James Martin is all too focused on for a Catholic priest. And the plan to do this is based on the logic of the church needing to listen to the lived experiences of those who identify with their sinful inclinations. Paying any attention whatsoever on immutable truth, on the reality of immutable truth to the lived experiences of people is a condemned heresy. That's part of the heresy of modernism. It says right out of Pope St. Pius X's papal encyclical condemning the heresy. And so you have a open modernist theologian who is a heretic, and a formal heretic is not even Catholic. That's what the church has always said. Do you think a theologian does not know that he's a modernist? Let me know in the comments if you think there's any possibility that this theologian does not understand that his entire frame of understanding Catholicism has been formally condemned by the church, making him a heretic. Let me know in the comments if you find that even plausible. As you'll hear here, the interviewer asked the theologian what working group and spring synodal talking sessions he's part of, and his answer is frankly eye-opening. Quote, Our group is dealing with the theme theological criteria and synodal methods for common discernment in doctrinal, pastoral, and ethical disputes. We are very different in our skills and origins. Italy, South America, Africa, the Congo. We are men and women, but this is a great opportunity and a very important condition for doing good work. Each of us can bring our skills and our perspective to share our reflections as theologians. This is the general aim of our group, to do theology, to reflect on our theology and its practical implications in today's world, a world that has changed a lot compared to the past. The mission of our group of experts has two main focuses. The first is to develop criteria of discernment. The second is to address some important doctrinal, ethical, and pastoral issues in the Catholic Church today. As the Instrumentum Laboris says, this also involves Christians with the James Martin inclination, as well as issues related to gender and the having multiple spouses. It is clear that it is impossible to, quote, solve all these issues in a small circle of theologians and believers. We are in a process with the whole universal church, even if the issues are very different. Having multiple spouses is a typically African issue, while the other issues are also widely discussed in Western countries. So the main aim of our group is to propose criteria, that is, a method, a style, and a way of dealing with controversial questions and issues. Between the criteria and the concrete issues, there is of course a kind of virtuous circle. Ultimately, the link between criteria and concrete issues is very closely linked to the relationship between practice and theory in the Church, but also more generally in human life. I think that faced with current problems, we cannot proceed by deriving so-called solutions from abstract principles. We should always start from the experience, the concrete history of people, without of course forgetting the question of the universal good contained in every situation. Only at the end of this process are we able to recognize the concretely possible good. End quote. That's word salad. That's what that is. It's often very apparent that academics cannot make their point in plain language. But here's what he's saying, since I speak academese. The synod is putting into the hands of hand-selected laity, like this one who gets called the Italian James Martin, by the way, the power to rethink the criteria for the Church to address moral questions, doctrinal questions. The criteria for the Church addressing these issues must not be hard and fixed principles, but malleable, able to adjust to the ever-changing needs of the world. It's a form of doctrinal and moral relativism. Case in point, persons having multiple spouses, which he says is an issue mainly for Africa. He never says why you'll really only find that in Africa, because Christianity says no to that practice, and for 2,000 years has effectively stamped out the practice anywhere it's popped up. That doesn't matter to this theologian. It doesn't matter that the Church has always opposed this. Now we must take into consideration their lived, personal, real experiences, whatever that means, since the aim is now not to stamp the practice out. Instead, on that issue, and that sin that James Martin has such a fixation on, again, the Church must essentially relativize its dogma. It must say, your lived experience is more important than the truth that the Church has always taught, and then adjust the Church's teaching instead of demanding sinners adjust their way of living to moral reality. This is moral relativism, which until this pontificate had been categorically rejected by the authorities in Rome, but no longer. Again, this priest is called the Italian James Martin for a reason, and he gives the game away with his next statement, which is in response to a question on whether he thinks the Church should rethink its teaching on that sin that James Martin has such a fixation on. Quote, I am not involved in pastoral accompaniment for the James Martin crowd, but only a theologian who also deals with these issues. First of all, I would like to say that it is obviously impossible to develop a new but necessary approach to that sin in a few lines. I believe that today we must rethink the traditional and incomprehensible for our time ethical considerations on that sin that interests James Martin so much. If in the past we spoke of it as contra naturam, against nature, today we must ask ourselves, what does nature mean? This Latin word has many very different meanings. Above all, the meaning of universality. And we must recognize that universality is necessary for moral knowledge, but we cannot think of universality, the good in the law, without the singularity, conscience, which in the sense of cultural anthropology always belongs to a particular culture. Morality cannot be reduced to a reason that is not deeply committed to the experience and lived life of an individual conscience with its specific culture. I believe the differences of the flesh are constitutive of human existence because it is the origin of our life. We all know that as children we come from a mother and a father. A person with a James Martin inclination does not deny this, but he does not find this difference attractive for himself. This orientation of the flesh does not depend on his choice. Ooh, lad. We must ask ourselves, why is it possible for good for such a person? The question of a person with this inclination is to live his inclinations by recognizing his vocation to relationships capable of closeness, care, communion, and fidelity to the other, and by seeking the good that is concretely possible for him. End quote. In other words, he has to have his sinful inclinations accepted by the church with similar moral norms imposed on those with such inclinations as there are imposed on those of us with nature-conforming inclinations. Do you see the problem here? It's no longer a rejection of the sin in rather stark terms, the way Scripture and tradition and the doctors of the church and the church fathers and, well, the church entirely through all of its history. No longer that, because it's no longer possible for our complicated, fallen world that has essentially embraced depravity. No. Instead, what the church must do now is call people to live and embrace their inclinations, but do so in the most conservative way possible. You see the problem here? That's where we are. That's what the Synod is going to be discussing in its spring little meeting sessions. Keep your eye on the ball, people. This is far from over. Now, there's a lot of other things going on in the world right now that demand our attention, and please pay attention to them. But don't forget that there are people in the church like this priest or like this theologian here who are actively and openly trying to change what the church has to say on such matters. What we do here at Return to Tradition is keep an eye on these things for you. So if you ever thought about supporting the work of Return to Tradition, Patreon or Subscribe Star or the join button below, there are options down in the description box or that join button. Your support does keep these messages coming. Let me know what you think about this in the comments, please. Hit like and subscribe if you haven't. It certainly helps. So does sharing this on social media. That helps a lot too. And as always, pray for the church. I'm Anthony Stine. Ave Maria.